Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to our Lehrman Auditorium. I'm John Hilbolt, Director of Lectures and Seminars. We, of course, welcome those joining us via the Internet at our heritage.org website. Our Internet viewers are always encouraged to ask questions, too. They can address them via email to speaker@heritage.org, speaker@heritage.org. And for those in-house, we ask that one last courtesy check that cell phones and pagers have been muted or turned off. And in the case of the panelists...
Put it on stun.
And in the case of the panelists, if they yell out from C-SPAN that it's interfering up here, we may make you throw it someplace else in the room, just for the benefit of us all. Clearly, we face a great conflict internationally in the war on terror. We're pleased today to have a discussion that hopefully will be a reality check for some of those who are not quite sure what we are facing in the years to come. We're pleased today to have this panel. It will be hosted by Dr. Ariel Cohen. Dr. Cohen is our Senior Research Fellow for Russia and Eurasian Studies and International Energy Security in our Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies. He is a native of Yalta. Dr. Cohen earned his Ph.D. at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. His areas of expertise range from economic development and political reform in the former Soviet republics to the global war on terror, the continuing conflict in the Middle East, and U.S. energy security policy. He is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London, and the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, my colleague, Ariel Cohen. Ariel?
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming and joining us today. Before I introduce our two speakers, I want to mention very briefly why I think it is so important to study primary sources. In any area you study, you have to understand what people that you're dealing with are thinking, what they're saying, and where they're coming from. To understand politics and to apply policy, you have to understand history, geography, religion, and politics of the place you're dealing with. Unfortunately, these days in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere in the decision-making strata of our society, those skills are badly lacking. Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago, said this famous dictum that know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you will not be defeated. Unfortunately, when I deal with our military, with our intelligence community, they have all the right strategies and they have all the management techniques that don't know their enemy, and they sometimes don't know themselves. The concept of jihad, that is a subject of Dr. Andrew Bostom's book, is at the core of the current long war. I have a book chapter on winning the war of ideas in the book called Winning the Long War that is published by Heritage a year ago. And in order to win the war, we have to understand the concept of the war. And I think this is what our speakers are going to elucidate today. Dr. Andrew Bostom is an associate professor of medicine, and the book that is on sale outside, and I encourage all of you to purchase the book, and Dr. Bostom will be available to sign for you. I think this is an important book because this brings you the sources, this brings you in the first person the views on jihad, on this key concept of the current conflict. The commentator today is someone I met about a year ago in Italy at a conference. Laurent Mouraviec is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He was a senior international policy analyst with the RAND Corporation. His main research areas are application of anthropology to strategy, the revolution of military affairs, and information warfare. Again, a key component of the current war on terrorism. Laurent taught philosophy in Paris and was a foreign correspondent in Germany and Central Europe for La Vie Française, a business weekly. He later co-founded and managed Geopol Services in Geneva, Switzerland, a consulting company that advised multinational corporations. And prior to moving to the United States, he was advisor to the French Minister of Defense and taught history of economic planning at École des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales, one of the grandes écoles in Paris. He also taught at Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington and has his BA and MA from Sorbonne. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Boston first, followed by Laurent Moravitz.
Thank you very much, Ariel, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today at the Heritage Foundation. It's also my great privilege to be with Laurent as well. I'm going to talk about the legacy of jihad in a particularly important context, and that is the context of historical Palestine. The only Marxist philosopher I appreciate, Groucho, once said, "Beside a dog, a book is man's best friend. Inside a dog, it's too dark to read." Groucho's satirical wisdom explains the lack of general knowledge about the two uniquely Islamic institutions I will introduce today, jihad and dhimmitud. Both are copiously documented in chronicles and documents and books whose brilliant light remains concealed by the darkness of denial, obfuscation, and apathetic ignorance. Jihad and its corollary institution, dhimmitud, have shaped events in historical Palestine, modern Israel, Judea, Samaria, Gaza, and Jordan from 634 through the present. This living legacy, including the initial jihad conquest and imposition of Muslim rule in historical Palestine, set in place archetypal patterns which are still quite evident. There is just one historically relevant meaning of jihad, despite contemporary apologetics. The noted 19th century Arabic lexicographer E.W. Lane, who studied the etymology of the term, observed, quote, "Jihad came to be used by the Muslims to signify waging war against unbelievers," unquote. Jihad was pursued century after century because jihad embodied an ideology and a jurisdiction. Both were formally conceived by Muslim jurisconsults and theologians from the 8th to 9th centuries onward, based on their interpretation of Quranic verses and long chapters in the Hadith, or acts and sayings of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, especially those recorded by Bukhari and Muslim. Ibn Khaldun, who died in 1406, jurist, renowned philosopher, historian, and sociologist, summarized these consensus opinions from 5 centuries of prior Muslim jurisprudence with regard to the uniquely Islamic institution of jihad. Quote, "In the Muslim community, the holy war is a religious duty because of the universalism of the Muslim mission and the obligation to convert everybody to Islam either by persuasion or by force. The other religious groups did not have a universal mission, and the holy war was not a religious duty for them, save only for purposes of defense. Islam is under obligation to gain power over other nations," unquote. To understand the legacy of jihad in historical Palestine, one must return to Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, and its founder, Muhammad. September 622 marks a defining event in Islam, the Hijra. Muhammad and a coterie of followers, persecuted by fellow Banu Quraysh tribesmen, fled from Mecca to Yathrib, later known as Medina. The Muslim sources describe Yathrib as having been a Jewish city, founded by a Palestinian diaspora population which had survived the revolt against the Romans. The Jews of the North Arabian Peninsula were highly productive oasis farmers. These Jews were eventually joined by itinerant Arab tribes from southern Arabia, who settled adjacent to them and transitioned to a sedentary existence. Following Muhammad's arrival, he reordered Medinan society. The Jewish tribes were isolated. Some were then expelled, and the remainder attacked and exterminated. Muhammad distributed among his followers as booty the vanquished Jews' property, plantations, fields, and houses, using this booty to establish a well-equipped jihadist cavalry corps. Muhammad's subsequent interaction with the Christians of northern Arabia followed a similar pattern, noted by the scholar of early Islam, Richard Bell. The, quote, "relationship with the Christians ended as that with the Jews ended, in war," unquote. because Islam as presented by Muhammad was a divine truth, and unless Christians accepted this formulation, which included Muhammad's authority, quote, conflict was inevitable and there could have been no real peace while he, Muhammad, lived, unquote. Within 2 years of Muhammad's death, Abu Bakr, the first caliph, launched the Great Jihad. And the essential pattern of these jihad wars is captured in the classical Muslim historian al-Tabari's recording of the recommendation given by Umar bin al-Khattab, the second rightly guided caliph, to the commander of the troops he sent to Basra during the conquest of Iraq in 636. Quote, summon the people to Allah. Those who respond to your call, accept it from them. But those who refuse must pay the poll tax out of humiliation and lowliness. Quran 9:29. If they refuse this, it is the sword without leniency. Fear Allah with regard to what you have been entrusted, unquote. The ensuing 3 decades witnessed Islam's most spectacular expansion, as Muslim armies subdued the entire Arabian Peninsula and conquered territories which had been in Greco-Roman possession since the reign of Alexander the Great. Within a century of Muhammad's death, the jihad wars of his successors had expanded the Muslim empire to from what is now Portugal to modern Pakistan. Moshe Gill, in his monumental History of Palestine, 634 to 1099, not the catchiest title, but an outstanding book, emphasizes the singular centrality that Palestine occupied in the mind of its pre-Islamic Jewish inhabitants, who referred to the land as Al-Shem. Indeed, as Gill observes, at the dawn of the Arab-Muslim conquest, the sizable Jewish population in Palestine, who formed a majority of its inhabitants when grouped with the Samaritans, were, quote, the direct descendants of the generations of Jews who had lived there since the days of Joshua bin Nun, in other words, for some 2,000 years, unquote. Jews and Christians speaking Aramaic inhabited the cities and the cultivated inner regions, devoid of any unique ties to the Bedouin of the desert hinterlands, who were regarded as bellicose and threatening in the writings of both the Church Fathers and Talmudic sources. The following is a summary of the devastating consequences of the Arab-Muslim conquest of Palestine during the 4th decade of the 7th century, directed by the first 2 caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar bin al-Khattab. The entire Gaza region up to Caesarea was sacked and devastated in the campaign of 634, which included the slaughter of 4,000 Jewish, Christian, and Samaritan peasants. Villages in the Negev were also pillaged, and towns such as Jerusalem, Gaza, Jaffa, Caesarea, Nablus, and Beth Shean were isolated. In his sermon on the day of the Epiphany, 636, Sophronius, Patriarch of Jerusalem, bewailed the destruction of the churches and monasteries, the sacked towns and villages, and the fields laid waste by the invaders. Thousands of people perished in 639, victims of the famine and plague wrought by this wanton destruction. The Muslim historian Baladuri maintained that 30,000 Samaritans and 20,000 Jews lived in Caesarea alone just prior to the Arab-Muslim conquest. Afterward, all evidence of them disappears. Archaeological data confirms the lasting devastation wrought by these initial jihad conquests, particularly the widespread destruction of synagogues and churches from the Byzantine era, whose remnants are still being unearthed. The total number of towns was reduced from 58 to 17 in the red sand hills and swamps of the western coastal plain, i.e. the Sharon. Massive soil erosion from the Judean mountains' western slopes also occurred due to agricultural uprooting during this period. Finally, the papyri of Nasana were completely discontinued after the year 700, reflecting how the Negev also experienced the destruction of its agriculture and the desertion of its villages. And what was the nature of the system of governance imposed upon the conquered indigenous Jews, Samaritans, and Christians of Palestine? In his seminal The Laws of Islamic Governance, al-Mawardi, a renowned jurist of Baghdad, examined the regulations pertaining to the lands and infidel populations subjugated by jihad. This is the origin of the system of dhimmitude. The native infidel dhimmi, which derives from both the word for pact and also guilt, guilty of religious errors. These dhimmi populations had to recognize Islamic ownership of their land, submit to Islamic law, and accept payment of the Quranic poll tax, the jizya, based on Quran 929. Mawardi notes that the enemy makes a payment in return for peace and reconciliation. He then distinguishes 2 cases. 1, payment is made immediately and is treated like booty. It does not, however, prevent a jihad being carried out against them in the future. 2, payment is made yearly and will constitute an ongoing tribute by which their security is established. Reconciliation and security last as long as the payment is made. If the payment ceases, then the jihad resumes. A treaty of reconciliation may be renewable, but must not exceed 10 years. The contract of the jizya, or dhimma, encompassed other obligatory and recommended obligations for the conquered non-Muslim dhimmi peoples. Collectively, these obligations formed a discriminatory system of dhimmitude imposed upon non-Muslims, Jews, Christians, as well as Zoroastrians, Hindus, and Buddhists, subjugated by jihad. Some of the more salient features of dhimmitude include the prohibition of arms for the vanquished dhimmis and of church bells, restrictions concerning the building and restoration of churches, synagogues, and temples, inequality between Muslims and non-Muslims with regard to taxes and penal law, the refusal of dhimmi testimony by Muslim courts, a requirement that Jews, Christians, and other non-Muslims, including Zoroastrians and Hindus, wear special clothes, and the overall humiliation and abasement of non-Muslims. It is important to note that these regulations and attitudes were institutionalized as permanent features of the sacred Islamic law, or Sharia. The writings of the much lionized Sufi theologian and jurist Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, highlight how the institution of dhimmitude was simply a normative and prominent feature of the Sharia. And here's what Ghazali said. The dhimmi is obliged not to mention Allah or his apostle. Jews, Christians, and Magians, probably Zoroastrians, must pay the jizya. On offering up the jizya, the dhimmi must hang his head while the official takes hold of his beard and hits the dhimmi on the protuberant bone beneath his ear, probably the mandible. They are not permitted to ostentatiously display their wine or church bells. Their houses may not be higher than the Muslims, no matter how low that is. The dhimmi may not ride an elegant horse or mule. He may ride a donkey only if the saddle work is of wood. He may not walk on the good part of the road. They, the dhimmis, have to wear an identifying patch on their clothing. Even women, and even in the public baths, dhimmis must hold their tongues, unquote. The practical consequences of such a discriminatory system were summarized in A.S. Triton's 1930, The Caliphs and Their Non-Muslim Subjects, a pioneering treatise on the status of the dhimmis, and this is from Triton's summary. Caliphs destroyed churches to obtain materials for their buildings, and the mob was always ready to pillage churches and monasteries. Dhimmis always lived on sufferance, exposed to the caprices of the ruler and the passions of the mob. In later times, they were much more liable to suffer from the violence of the crowd, and the popular fanaticism was accompanied by an increasing strictness among the educated. The spiritual isolation of Islam was accomplished. The world was divided into two classes, Muslims and the others, and only Islam counted. Indeed, the general feeling was that the leavings of the Muslims were good enough for the dhimmis, unquote. And I want to review quickly how dhimmitude was imposed during the initial period of Muslim rule in Palestine, so going from 634 until the First Crusade. The stark, unromantic reality of Muslim-ruled Palestine during these 465 years is perhaps best illustrated by examining a putative golden age during the Abbasid Baghdadian Caliphate between 750 and 878. Under early Abbasid rule, approximately 750 to 755, Greek sources report orders demanding the removal of crosses over churches, bans on church services and teaching of the scriptures, the eviction of monks from their monasteries, and excessive taxation. Gill notes in 772 when Caliph al-Mansur visited Jerusalem, quote, he ordered a special mark should be stamped on the hands of the Christians and the Jews. Many Christians fled to Byzantium, unquote. Bachior elucidates the fiscal oppression inherent in 8th century Palestine, which devastated the dhimmi Jewish and Christian peasantry. Quote, overtaxed and tortured by the tax collectors, the villagers fled into hiding or emigrated into towns, unquote. She quotes from a detailed chronicle of an 8th century monk completed in 774. Quote, the men scattered, they became wanderers. Everywhere the fields were laid waste. The countryside pillaged. The people went from one land to another, unquote. The Greek chronicler Theophanes provides a contemporary description of the chaotic events which transpired after the death of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid in 809. He describes Palestine as the scene of violence, rape, and murder from which Christian monks fled to Cyprus and Constantinople. Perhaps the clearest outward manifestations of the inferiority and humiliation of the dhimmis were the prohibitions regarding their dress codes and the demands that distinguishing signs be placed on the entrances of dhimmi houses. During the Abbasid Caliphates of Harun al-Rashid, 786 to 809, and al-Mutawakkil, 847-861, Jews and Christians were required to wear yellow as patches attached to their garments or hats. Later, to differentiate further between Christians and Jews, the Christians were required to wear blue. In 850, consistent with Quranic verses associating them with Satan and hell, al-Mutawakkil decreed that Jews and Christians attach wooden images of devils to the doors of their homes to distinguish them from the homes of Muslims. Muslim Turkoman rule of Palestine for the nearly 3 decades just prior to the Crusades, so 1071 to 1099, was characterized by such unrelenting warfare and devastation that an imminent end of days atmosphere was engendered. A contemporary poem by Solomon Hakon ben Joseph, believed to be a descendant of the Geonim, an illustrious family of Palestinian Jews of priestly descent, speaks of destruction and ruin, the burning of harvests, the razing of plantations, the desecration of cemeteries, and acts of violence, slaughter, and plunder. The brutal nature of the Crusaders' conquest of Palestine, particularly of the major cities, beginning in 1098-99, has been copiously documented. However, the devastation wrought by both Crusader conquest and rule through the last decades of the 13th century cannot reasonably be claimed to have approached, let alone somehow exceeded, what transpired during the first 4.5 centuries of Muslim jihad conquest, endless internecine struggles for Muslim dominance, and imposition of dhimmitude. Moreover, we cannot ignore the testimony of Isaac bin Samuel of Acre, who lived from 1270 to 1350, one of the most outstanding Kabbalists of his time. Conversant with Islamic theology and often using Arabic in his exegesis, Isaac nevertheless believed that it was preferable to live under the yoke of Christendom rather than that of Islamdom. Acre was taken from the Crusaders by the Mamluks in 1291 during a very brutal jihad conquest. Thus, despite the precept to dwell in the Holy Land, Isaac bin Samuel fled to Italy and thence to Christian Spain, where he wrote the following: "The Muslims strike upon the head of the children of Israel who dwell in their lands, and they extort money from them by force. For they say in their tongue, it is lawful to take money of the Jews. In the eyes of the Muslims, the children of Israel are as open to abuse as an unprotected field. Even in their law and statutes, they rule that the testimony of a Muslim is always to be believed against that of a Jew. For this reason, our rabbis of blessed memory have said, rather beneath the yoke of Edom, Christendom, than that of Ishmael," unquote. And 120 years earlier, in 1172, Maimonides had written these words, having escaped in 1148 the purely mythical tolerance of Muslim Spain, specifically Cordoba, during the jihad depredations of the Almohads. And here's what Maimonides wrote: "The nation of Ishmael persecute us severely and devise ways to harm us and to debase us. None has matched it in debasing and humiliating us. None has been able to reduce us as they have. We have done as our sages of blessed memory instructed us, bearing the lies and absurdities of Ishmael. We listen but remain silent. In spite of all this, we are not spared from the ferocity of their wickedness and their outbursts at any time. On the contrary, the more we suffer and choose to conciliate them, the more they choose to act belligerently towards us," unquote. Sadly, this chronic, grinding oppression, interspersed with paroxysms of violent fanaticism, persisted throughout the approximately 630-year period combined, so 1291 to 1918, of Mamluk and then Ottoman Muslim rule of historical Palestine until the British Mandate after World War I. For example, the Polish Jew Gedalia of Siemiaty, he died in 1716, having braved numerous perils, came to Jerusalem in 1700 and recorded these observations in his book, Pray for the Peace of Jerusalem, motivating him to return to Europe in order to raise funds for the Jews of Jerusalem. And here's what he wrote: "No Jew or Christian is allowed to ride a horse, but a donkey is permitted. For in the eyes of Muslims, Christians and Jews are inferior beings. The Muslims do not allow any member of another faith, unless he converts to their religion, entry to the Temple Mount area, for they claim that no other religion is sufficiently pure to enter this holy spot. Moreover, the Muslim law requires that each religious denomination wear its specific garment." So now we're 1,000 years beyond the Abbasid period. "Moreover, the Muslim law requires that each religious denomination wear its specific garment so that each people may be distinguished from another. This distinction also applies to footwear. Indeed, the Jews wear shoes of a dark blue color, whereas Christians wear red shoes. No one can use green, for this color is worn solely by Muslims. The latter are very hostile toward Jews and inflict upon them vexations in the streets of the city. The common folk persecute the Jews, for we are forbidden to defend ourselves against the Turks or the Arabs. If an Arab strikes a Jew, he, the Jew, must appease him, but dare not rebuke him, for fear that he may be struck even harder, which they, the Arabs, do without the slightest scruple. Even the Christians are subjected to these vexations. If a Jew offends a Muslim, the latter strikes him a brutal blow with his shoe in order to demean him, without anyone's being able to prevent him from doing it. The Christians fall victim to the same treatment and suffer as much as the Jews, except that the former are very rich by reason of the subsidies that they receive from abroad, and they use this money to bribe the Arabs. As for the Jews, they do not possess much money with which to oil the palms of the Muslims, and consequently they are subject to much greater suffering," unquote. These prevailing conditions for Jews and Christians did not improve in a consistent or substantive manner even after the mid-19th century treaties imposed by the European powers on the weakened Ottoman Empire included provisions for the Tanzimat reforms. First introduced in 1839, these reforms were designed to end the discriminatory laws of dimitude for both Jews and Christians living under the Ottoman Sharia. European consuls endeavored to maintain compliance with at least two cardinal principles central to any meaningful implementation of the reforms: respect for the life and property of non-Muslims, and the right for Christians and Jews to provide evidence in Islamic courts when a Muslim was a party. Unfortunately, these efforts to replace the Muslim concept of superiority over infidels with the principles of equal rights failed. Tudor Parfitt's 1987 analysis of the entire Tanzimat period concluded that these problems persisted through the close of the 19th century. Quote, "The courts were biased against the dhimmis, and even when a case was heard in a properly assembled court where dhimmi testimony was admissible, the court would still almost invariably rule against the dhimmis. Inside the towns, Jews and other dhimmis were frequently attacked, wounded, and even killed by local Muslims and Turkish soldiers. Such attacks were frequently for trivial reasons," unquote. During World War I in Palestine, the embattled Young Turk government actually began deporting the Jews of Tel Aviv in the spring of 1917, an ominous parallel to the genocidal deportations of the Armenian dhimmi communities throughout Anatolia. Ultimately, enforced abrogation of the laws and social practices of dhimmitude required the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, which only occurred during the European Mandate period following World War I. Remarkably soon afterwards, however, i.e. within 2 years of the abrogation of the Sharia, by 1920, Musa Kazim el-Husani, former governor of Jaffa during the final years of Ottoman rule and president of the Arab-Palestinian Congress, requested the restoration of the Sharia in a letter to the British High Commissioner, Herbert Samuels. And here's an excerpt from that letter. "Ottoman Turkey has drafted such laws as suit our customs. This was done relying upon the Sharia, religious law, in force in Arabic territories, that is engraved in the very hearts of the Arabs, and has been assimilated in their customs, and that has been applied in the modern Arab states. We therefore ask the British government that it should respect these laws that were in force under the Turkish Empire." A strong Arab-Muslim irredentist current, which achieved preeminence after the 1929 riots, promulgated the forcible restoration of dhimmitude via jihad, culminating in the widespread violence of 1936 to 39. Two prominent Muslim personalities, Sheikh Izzeldin al-Qasim, after whom the rockets are named, and Haj Amin el-Husani, the former Mufti of Jerusalem, embodied this trend. And both these leaders relied upon the ideology of jihad with its virulent anti-infidel incitement to garner popular support. Al-Qassam called for the preservation of the country's Arab-Muslim character exclusively, and urged an uncompromising and intensified struggle against the British Mandate and the Jewish national home in Palestine. Palestine could be freed from the danger of Jewish domination, he believed, not by sporadic protests, demonstrations, or riots, which were soon forgotten, but by an organized and methodical armed struggle. In his sermons, he often quoted verses from the Quran referring to jihad, linking them with topical matters and his own political ideas. Al-Qassam and his devoted followers committed various acts of jihad terror targeting Jewish civilians in northern Palestine from 1931 through 1935. On November 20th, 1935, Al-Qassam was surrounded by British police in a cave near Jenin and killed, along with 3 of his henchmen. In the immediate aftermath of his death, this is the scene. Virtually overnight, Izzeldin al-Qasim became the object of a full-fledged cult. The bearded sheikh's picture appeared in all the Arabic language papers, accompanied by banner headlines and inflammatory articles. Memorial prayers were held in mosques throughout the country. He was proclaimed a martyr who had sacrificed himself for the fatherland. His grave at Balad al-Sheikh became a place of pilgrimage, and his deeds were extolled as an illustrious example to be followed by all. Haj Amin al-Husani was appointed Mufti of Jerusalem by the British High Commissioner in May 1921. Throughout his public career, the Mufti relied upon traditional Quranic anti-Jewish motifs to arouse the Arab street. For example, during the incitement which led to the 1929 Arab revolt in Palestine, he called for combating and slaughtering, quote, the Jews, not merely Zionists. In fact, most of the Jewish victims of the 1929 Arab revolt were Jews from the centuries-old dhimmi communities, for example, in Hebron, as opposed to recent settlers identified with the Zionist movement. With the ascent of Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, the Mufti and his coterie intensified their anti-Semitic activities to secure support from Hitler's Germany for a jihad to annihilate the Jews of Palestine. Following his expulsion from Palestine by the British, the Mufti fomented a brutal anti-Jewish pogrom in Baghdad in 1941, concurrent with his failed effort to install a pro-Nazi Iraqi government. Escaping to Europe after his unsuccessful coup attempt, the Mufti spent the remainder of World War II in Germany and Italy. From this sanctuary, he provided active support for the Germans by recruiting Bosnian Muslims, in addition to Muslim minorities from the Caucasus, for dedicated Nazi SS units. The Mufti's objectives for these recruits, and Muslims in general, were made explicit during his multiple wartime radio broadcasts from Berlin, heard throughout the Arab world, an international campaign of genocide against the Jews. For example, during his March 1, 1944 broadcast, he stated, "Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion," unquote. Invoking the personal support of such prominent Nazis as Himmler and Eichmann, the Mufti's relentless hectoring of German, Romanian, and Hungarian government officials caused the cancellation of an estimated 480,000 exit visas, which had been granted to Jews, 80,000 from Romania and 400,000 from Hungary. As a result, these hapless individuals were deported to Polish concentration camps. The United Nations Assembly document presented in 1947, which contained the Mufti's June 28, 1943 letter to the Hungarian foreign minister requesting the deportation of Hungarian Jews to Poland, includes this stark, telling annotation. As a sequel to this request, 400,000 Jews were subsequently killed. And according to historian Howard M. Sacker, meetings the Mufti held with Hitler in 1941 and 1942 led to an understanding whereby Hitler's forces would invade Palestine with their goal being, quote, not the occupation of the Arab lands, but solely the destruction of Palestinian Jewry, unquote. This April, the director of the Nazi Research Center in Ludwigsburg, Klaus Michael Mollmann, and Berlin historian Martin Kupers revealed that a murderous Einsatzgruppe Egypt, connected to Rommel's Africa Corps, was stationed in Athens, awaiting British expulsion from the Levant prior to beginning their planned slaughter of the roughly 500,000 Jews in Palestine. This plan was only aborted after Rommel's defeat by Montgomery at El Alamein, Egypt, in October-November 1942. The Mufti escaped to the Middle East after the war to avoid capture and possible prosecution for war crimes. Yasser Arafat always characterized the Mufti as his primary spiritual and political mentor, and beginning at the age of 16, worked for the Mufti performing terrorist operations. Beginning in the early 1960s until his recent death, Yasser Arafat orchestrated a relentless campaign of 4 decades of jihad terrorism against the Jewish state, interspersed with a bloody jihad during the mid-1970s and early 1980s against the Christians of Lebanon. Arafat adopted a thin veneer of secular radicalism, particularly during the 1960s and early 1970s. Sober analysis reveals, however, that shorn of these superficial secular trappings, Arafat's core ideology remained quintessentially Islamic, i.e. rooted in jihad, throughout his career as a terrorist leader. Even after the Oslo Accords, within a week of signing the specific Gaza-Jericho agreements, Arafat issued a brazen pronouncement at a meeting of South African Muslim leaders reflecting his unchanged jihadist views. Here's what he said. The jihad will continue, and Jerusalem is not for the Palestinian people alone. It is for the entire Muslim ummah. You are responsible for Palestine and Jerusalem before me. No, it is not their capital, it is our capital, unquote. During the final decade of his life, Arafat reiterated these sentiments on numerous occasions. He also acted upon them, orchestrating an escalating campaign of jihad terrorism, which culminated in the organized campaign of homicide bombings that led to Israel's Operation Defensive Shield military operations in the West Bank, 2 days after the Netanya Passover massacre on March 27, 2002. Throughout Arafat's tenure as the major Palestinian Arab leader, his efforts to destroy Israel and replace it with an Arab-Muslim Sharia-based entity were integrated into the larger Islamic Ummah's jihad against the Jewish state, as declared repeatedly in official conference pronouncements from various clerical or political organizations of the Muslim nations for over 5 decades. For example, the New York Times reported in a front-page headline on March 16, 1948, 1 day after Israel declared its independence. This is the headline. Jews in grave danger in all Muslim lands. 900,000 in Africa and Asia face wrath of their foes. The report went on to cite an Arab League text which stated that all Jews from Arab states would be considered, quote, members of the Jewish minority state of Palestine. Their bank accounts would be frozen and used to finance resistance to, quote, Zionist ambitions in Palestine. Jews believed to be active Zionists would be interned and their assets confiscated. The same May 16, 1948 New York Times article also discussed a memorandum detailing, quote, many instances of persecution of Jewish individuals and whole communities. Finally, these excerpts from the recent 2003 Putrajaya Islamic Summit speech by former Malaysian Prime Minister Dr. Mahathir Mohamad highlight the official collective sentiments of Muslim leaders, reiterated ad nauseum since the creation of Israel. This is what Mahathir Mohamad said. Quote, "To begin with, the governments of all the Muslim countries can close ranks and have a common stand on Palestine. We need guns and rockets, bombs and warplanes, tanks and warships. We may want to recreate the first century of the Hijra, the way of life in those times, in order to practice what we think to be the true Islamic way of life. 1.3 billion Muslims cannot be defeated by a few million Jews. There must be a way. And we can only find a way if we stop to think, to assess our weaknesses and our strength, to plan, to strategize, and then to counterattack. As Muslims, we must seek guidance from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. Surely the 23-year struggle of the Prophet can provide us with some guidance as to what we can and should do. It is within this overall historical context that one must view contemporary Palestinian Muslim pronouncements regarding the status of non-Muslims, Jews in particular, but Christians as well, under past, present, and future Islamic rule. For example, the Palestinian Authority Undersecretary for Religious Endowment, Sheikh Yusuf Salama, representing the PA at a May 1999 intercultural conference in Tehran, praised the 7th century system of al-Dimma, the system of dimitude, which I've been describing, as the proper paradigm for relations between Muslims and Christians today. During a Friday sermon broadcasted live on June 6, 2001 on PA-TV from the Sheikh Ijlan Mosque in Gaza, Palestinian Authority employee Sheikh Muhammad Ibrahim al-Mahdi reiterated these sentiments with regard to Jews. This is June 2001. Quote, "We welcome, as we did in the past, any Jew who wants to live in this land as a dhimmi, just as Jews have lived in our countries as dhimmis, and have earned appreciation, and some of them have even reached the positions of counselor or minister here and there. We welcome the Jews to live as dhimmis. But the rule in this land and in all the Muslim countries must be the rule of Allah," unquote. More recently, interviewed by Wall Street Journal reporter Carby Leggett in late December 2005, Hassam al-Masalmeh, who heads the Hamas contingent at the Municipal Council of Bethlehem, confirmed the organization's plan to reinstitute the humiliating jizya. Al-Masalmeh stated explicitly, "We in Hamas tend to implement this tax," he means the jizya, someday. "We say it openly. We welcome everyone to Palestine, but only if they agree to live under our rules," unquote. Such Hamas policies will likely exacerbate the ongoing Christian exodus from Arab-controlled Judea-Samaria, especially Bethlehem. An April Reuters report indicated 1,000 Christians per year leaving these areas due to Muslim depredations, including assaults on Christians, uprooting their olive trees and scrolling graffiti that depicts nuns being raped. Finally, after Hamas issued a warning to the YMCA of Qalqilia to close its offices and leave town, as reported on April 21st, a Qalqilia Christian leader commented aptly, quote, "The face of the new Hamas government is coming to the forefront now that they finally took over and have a lot more confidence. They want to create a territory free of Christians and Jews," unquote. There have been ceaseless calls for jihad in Palestine during modern times. In the 1920s and 30s by Haj Amin al-Hosseini and Izz al-Din al-Qassam, by the late Yasser Arafat throughout his 40 years as leader of Fatah and the PLO, and now under Hamas. Hamas's foundational covenant calls for an annihilationist jihad to eradicate Israel. It states very clearly, there is no solution to the Palestinian problem except by jihad, unquote. Iranian Revolutionary Guard officers are presently assisting Hamas commanders in arming and training a new jihadist army called the Merbitun, a name which derives from the pious Almoravid religious warriors, Islamized Berbers whose jihad campaigns ravaged North Africa and Iberia in the 11th and 12th centuries. And on April 1st, 2006, the new Palestinian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mahmoud al-Zahar, made clear the goal of such jihadists. Quote, "Our dream to have our independent state on all historic Palestine will become real one day. I'm certain of this because there is no place for the state of Israel on this land," unquote. Thus, let me close with these penetrating insights from historian Batya Or, who observed that jihad remained, quote, "the main cause of the Arab-Israeli conflict, since Israelis are to be regarded, per force, only as a religious community, their national characteristics, a geographical territory related to a past history, a system of legislation, a specific language and culture are consequently denied. The, quote, Arab character of the Palestinian territory is inherent in the logic of jihad. Having become fey territory by conquest, i.e. taken from an infidel people, it must remain within the Dar al-Islam. The State of Israel, established on this state territory, is consequently illegal. And she concluded, Israel represents the successful national liberation of a dhimmi civilization on a territory formerly Arabized by Jihad and the Dhimma, a pre-Islamic language, culture, topographical geography, and national institutions have been restored to life. This reversed the process of centuries in which the cultural, social, and political structures of the indigenous population of Palestine were destroyed. In 1974, Abu Iyad, second in command to Arafat in the Fatah hierarchy, announced, it's a remarkable quote, "We intend to struggle so that our Palestinian homeland does not become a new Andalusia." The comparison of Andalusia to Palestine was not fortuitous, since both countries were Arabized and then de-Arabized by a pre-Arabic culture. Thank you very much.
I think Andy has given you a lot of reasons to read his book, and I'm going to try to give you more reasons. On September 11th, 2001, Americans wondered, what's happening? Why do they hate us? And what is jihad? And Americans turned to the experts, academia and the diplomats, John Esposito at Georgetown, Juan Cole, most former American ambassadors to Saudi Arabia, and they all had one thing to say. Islam is a religion of peace. Jihad is really greater jihad, which is a spiritual exertion, whereas small jihad, which of course is a little bit of violence, is the exception. At any rate, it's all the fault of colonialism, neocolonialism, capitalism, imperialism, Zionism, U.S. policies. In other words, the Leninist grand narrative is what our ambassadors and academics were telling us. And from the Muslim world, we heard, of course, that it was our fault and all the rest of it. And anyway, whoever had done September 11th couldn't be a Muslim because circular argument, Islam is a religion of peace, etc. All of this represented an erasure of memory, a destruction of history, and pure scholarly fraud. And that is one of the wonderful uses of Andy's book. It documents it from the horse's mouth, as it were. Now, let me mention what the great Princeton historian Patricia Crone writes at the beginning of one of her books. Most people, she wrote, and certainly all members of Western civilization, are born into a world which differs radically from that of their ancestors, with the result that most of human history is a closed book to them. And it is so closed that you need to open Andy's book to reopen the reality of that history which has been erased from memory. Now, picture this weird place called Europe. I'm not talking of today's weird Europe. I'm talking of old Europe, before Rumsfeld Europe. Europe and Christendom were under siege from Islam from 650 to 1683. It was a relentless siege, a never-ending siege, a very brutal and violent one, which entailed the occupation of large parts of Europe. So, yes, there was this rather short interval of the failed counter-offensive of Christendom, called the Crusades, which started 400 years after the original invasion, but were unsuccessful. In 1670 or so, the King of Poland, Jan Sobieski, leading an army, a Polish army, intercepted a very large column of Tatar warriors, Muslim warriors, whose wonderful jihad against Central Europe had netted 44,000 slaves who were being brought by that army towards the slave markets of the Black Sea. in order to be redispatched and sold. Europe was under siege. So I would like to say that all these wonderful things we heard after September 11th are false, and that the reality is that jihad is rooted in the fundamental tenets of Islam. There's a formidable corpus of jurisprudence, much of which is in Andy's book. So you can read it. I mean, it's not a matter of opinion, I agree, I disagree, etc. It's there, you read it. You read the Muslim jurists, the faqih over a period of 1400 years, and it's all there. And you don't read selectively. You read many of them, you read them in time, in space, in different schools of Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, in different sects. It's all there. Secondly, from 622 AD, jihad never stopped. Jihad never ever stopped. It cannot stop because it is rooted in the nature of Islam. It only stopped when it was stopped by others. But in the intent, it never ever stopped. And jihad is the forcible extension to the entire world of Muslim rule. Convert, die, or become a dhimmi, a low-class pariah. In the texts, in the minds, in practice, it is jihad as war which is original and has prevailed and dominated. Jihad as spiritual exertion is false advertisement, as Professor David Cook of Rice University has put it. And it's a very minor thing. And in the way that the concept of jihad was used and understood by the Muslim world until Europe became too strong and started encroaching, impinging, invading territories that had been ruled by Muslims. It is jihad as war, as holy war, to extend the holy writ that prevailed. Andy's book will give you access, which is otherwise rather difficult, to the doctrine and theory of jihad in Quran, in Hadith, in Sharia. It will allow you to read authoritative and leading Muslim scholars from the very early ones, the very early compilers of Hadith and the very early jurisprudence to today. It'll give you access to witnesses' accounts, to historian reports, including a lot of Muslim historians, and give you a chronology of what I've called the unending jihad. Frankly, Andy's book is an indictment of U.S. academia. It is a shame and a scandal that no scholar from our richly endowed universities, such as Harvard that just received $20 million from Prince Al-Walid of Saudi Arabia, such as the University of Georgetown, which got an equivalent gift. It is a shame that those universities have not done the job that an outsider who decided to work seriously actually succeeded in doing in a few years. Andy's book is an extraordinary database for any scholar of the Middle East, for any military officer, for any intelligence and counterintelligence officer who wants to understand what I've called the mind of jihad. It is a must reading. So if you really want to know what jihad has been in space and time in Muslim texts and minds, please read Andy's book.
Thank you. I suggest that we go to Q&A. I think we have about 10 minutes. The rules of the engagements are: A, please identify yourself; B, please keep it to a question; and C, please don't exceed 30 to 45 seconds for your question, because there are other people who want to ask questions. Yes, please.
I'm Al Milliken, affiliated with Washington Independent Writers. Do you see any way a serious, devoted, faithful, committed Muslim who believes the words of the Quran and Sharia law is there a way they can ultimately accept the land of Israel anywhere in land that Arabs and the related descendants of the Prophet Muhammad also claim?
It seems to be possible. I think the key step is to do what some Muslims have done. Unfortunately, they are often considered as heretics. But if you it starts by desacralizing the jihad. It starts by sort of self-abrogating the whole concept of fey territory and cardinal aspects of the Sharia, which relate to the conquest of territories that are considered permanently a part of the Dar al-Islam. There are Muslims who reject this. For example, there's an entire sect which unfortunately is outlawed in Pakistan called the Ahmadiyya. They qualitatively reject aggressive jihad warfare. Now the official government of Pakistan has called them heretics, and they're persecuted. So it's not a question of Muslims. It's a question of are we going to see a complete desacralization of the jihad and acceptance by Muslim states and authorities of concepts that really have come out of the Enlightenment. And I think that that's certainly possible. There have, by the way, there's a long history of a rationalist strain within Islamic civilization, not really necessarily within Islam. Unfortunately, these rationalists have systematically, through this day, been killed off as apostates. I think we need to embrace them. As I'm speaking now, Hirsi Ali is giving a book seminar at the Co-op at Harvard. She embodies this trend, simply introducing what we've come to accept as normative in the West, the period of the Enlightenment. She wants to see the Islamic world undergo that kind of enlightenment. But there are believing Muslims who reject the jihad, and I think that it is those Muslims that would accept Israel. Unfortunately, when you look at surveys that are done by Pew, etc., the notion in the Arab Muslim world and even the larger Islamic world that Israel has any basic right to exist, even within 1949 armistice borders, is not a commonly held notion. And those are just the facts.
Yeah, I'll say very briefly that yes, it's very possible, provided the individual concerned or the group concerned undergoes a crisis. It is an important crisis. It's a very positive crisis. It demands, and Andy used the word of abrogation, and it's true, it demands the abrogation of a lot of things in Quran, in Hadith, and in Sharia. In and of itself, this is a big crisis. But after all, which people, which nation, which religion became a positive force without undergoing this kind of crisis?
I would add that, for example, the Muslim leader of Italy, a gentleman named Palazzi, with, I believe, a doctorate in Islamic scholarship from Al-Azhar, the leading Islamic university in Cairo, not only recognizes Israel, he recognizes the right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and is very outspoken. The only thing I'm worried about is Mr. Palazzi's safety and security. There are interpretations. I mean, after all, let's not forget, we're talking about a narrative, we're talking about an interpretation, we're talking about religion. Religions, including Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and others, are given to different interpretations. And there is an interpretation in Islam, I believe within the orthodoxy of Islam, that says that Allah promised the land to the Jewish people because they recognize the Torah, or they say they recognize in a certain way the Torah as a preceding prophecy to Muhammad. Muhammad, after all, is the seal of the prophets. He's not the only prophet. Muslims recognize Jesus as a prophet, for that matter. So yes, if you interpret you can go a long, long way. I think in Sufi interpretation, jihad, for example, does not necessarily entail killing of the infidels. Marjorie Mandelbaum gave me a peek there, so I don't know if you have something to say about the Sufi interpretations. Okay, anybody else? A gentleman over there with white sweater. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. I'm Dino Drury. My Unitarian, just a private citizen who's interested. I'm the Unitarian Universalist congregation to which I belonged for a long time, actually had a sister congregation relationship with the local Ahmadiyya mosque after 9/11. The question, though, I would have for you is, it follows the previous question. Is there any reliable data on the proportion of Muslims who believe in the violent jihadist model versus those who don't? Inasmuch as you pointed out that there are all kinds of things in the Old Testament or the Christian New Testament that hardly anybody takes seriously, or literally rather, such as stoning heretics and this sort of, stoning adulterers and this sort of thing.
I think this raises an important point because aggressive jihad is not necessarily just warfare. There's also economic jihad, jihad by propaganda, dawah, etc. And the ultimate goal, whether it's through acute violence or not, is to impose the Sharia. So the more apt question is, what percentage of Muslims would like to see states that are not presently under the Sharia? And those data, particularly what's come to light in Europe, in the environment after the London bombings and the French riots, etc., are sobering, to put it mildly. 40% or so of British Muslims would like to see the current liberal constitutional democracy replaced with a Sharia state.
In Britain?
In Britain. 21% of German Muslims feel that German law is simply incompatible with the Quran, no matter what you do to twist and turn it, and that's not something that they're comfortable with. Again, I don't think the question is merely classical violent jihad warfare, which of course is genocidal and needs to be eliminated. But the question is, how many Muslims would like to remove, particularly in the West, what we regard as our basic freedoms of conscience, etc., and replace that structure with a Sharia state? And so I think that is and those numbers, and again, I mean, for people to openly admit that in a survey, one might think that being an epidemiologist, that might underestimate the true sentiments of the population if they're willing to be so brazen as to admit that.
Well, I made a living conducting poll research and focus groups for several years. Couple of comments. Number one, I have serious questions about reliability of execution of the polls. Not the design of the polls, the Pew polls, etc. But when you go to Saudi Arabia or you go to even Morocco, you use local subcontractors. And it is difficult in the environments which are not as accustomed to polling as we are. For example, I worked on Russia and the former Soviet Union when they made the transition from communism to wherever they are now. And there was a learning curve of the population. It was more difficult in '89 than in '92. It was more difficult in '92 than in '98. So there must be a culture of trust. But there are other indicators. There's an indicator of results of the elections. For example, in Pakistan, there is a coalition of Islamist parties that gets, 25%. The people vote Islamist as opposed to Islamic secular or moderately Muslim parties. I think that we're looking at large minorities throughout the Muslim world, and it varies from country to country, obviously. What bothers me is something different, and that is that, for example, in Egypt, when the regime very consistently preventing a rise of any kind of opposition, with the exception of Ikhwan, of the Muslim Brotherhood, then all the pent-up frustration translates itself to the support of the Islamist parties. It doesn't really mean that these people support the whole agenda. It means that they express their political frustration by voting Ikhwan. And we saw 80% of the available seats in the parliament went to the Muslim Brotherhood in the last parliamentary elections. In terms of, again, broad support, if Iran is an indication, people obviously do not support the Islamist platform. First of all, they violate the basic norms. They drink. They behave in a way that Sharia does not approve. And I saw the news today. It probably happened a couple of days ago. Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, allowed for women to participate in sports events in stadiums, in sport arenas, and he was overruled by the supreme leader, by the Rahbar. So even in that level of religiosity, there are divisions, etc. But generally, as I said, probably between 30 and 50, 20, 30, 40%, give or take, and then you need to go and do very specific, very detailed, controlled polls with random, with high level of control to make sure that your data is true. I don't think we have reliable data right now.
Let me add, I was asked recently in a debate, what about moderate Muslims? And moderate Muslims exist undeniably. We at Hudson had recently the director of Islamic Affairs of the Kingdom of Morocco, with whom we had a very interesting dialogue because we actually disagreed. Dialogue is something which you hold where you disagree, rather than trying to agree at all costs, like UNESCO or things like that. So we disagreed, but it was extraordinarily interesting to disagree, and I can say we have a common terrain to disagree and then to agree. But to this question of moderate Muslims, which are welcome, there were lots of moderate Germans under the Third Reich. Unfortunately, they were silent, mostly because to not be silent was to die. And they are, speak of Iran, for example, so many, Iran, this great ancient culture with incredible vigor, this unsinkable culture spread over thousands of years. Yes, there are many moderates. The problem with moderates is that they only count if they make themselves heard. Otherwise, they don't count. We're not talking in some abstract sense, are they moderates? We're talking about the politics, and we're talking about war and peace. If the Iranian regime is going to have nuclear weapons to carry out their jihad with, then the existence of moderates will be as irrelevant as the existence of moderate people in the places of Nazi Germany that were bombed.
Any other questions? Well, last question in the back. Please identify yourself.
Abid, Voice of America, Pashto Service. My question is from Mr. Boston. 1979 till 1989, Afghan were fighting against Russian, and they call their struggle as jihad. Now Hamas, they call their struggle as a jihad. What will be the difference between this jihad and this jihad?
What is the difference?
Yeah.
Nothing.
From whose point of view?
From the point of view of the people waging it, which is the one that ultimately counts.
Well, I see.
And I think that if you look at how the situation has evolved, you see, and Jihad does have a very long tradition of being defensive. There's no question about it. I mean, one of the most poignant things for me to learn about was the plight of the in Russia, the Chechens. They have clearly suffered terrible deprivations going back through the Muscovite Empire, etc. I mean, you know, they've caused plenty of their own depredations in terms of conquest and colonization, etc. But there's been a back and forth over centuries, and clearly many of the jihads waged by the Chechens have been defensive. But they've also been offensive, because even in the process of defending their immediate territorial aspirations, they always have larger aspirations, which is to Islamize as far as they can reach. And so I think that's exactly what you see in Afghanistan. And it became a center. Oh, yes, so the initial jihad is to expel the infidel communist Soviet invaders, et cetera, and then it becomes a nidus for Islamizing as far as the reach will take it. We see from Hamas, yes, it's a struggle to eliminate the Zionist crusaders, et cetera, but it's also part of a movement to Islamize in their fashion the region. As a matter of fact, on the Hamas children's website is a reference to Andalusia. Now, what on earth does that have to do with Hamas? Well, it has to do with Hamas because they would like to see Andalusia re-Islamized as well. So I think fundamentally these things are connected in very, very obvious and concrete ways.
Well, just to expand the same logic of Andalus, the southern Spain, the territory that was captured by Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV in Russia, starting from the upper Volga, Kazan, all the way down to Astrakhan. This is what, 1,500 kilometers, something like that, give or take? This was populated by Muslims. So applying the same logic, the Russian state may come under attack by today very secular population, which has its Islamic roots, and it takes only one generation of good, well-founded Wahhabi madrasas to turn that generation around and make at least part of it, not all of it, part of it, into fanatics. And if Russia thinks that today it can hedge and reach out to Iran and reach out to Hamas, and this will skip it, and that by killing all the Chechens, or at least all the opposing Chechens, they're going to win, I have news for them. This is from the other side, from the Islamic side. They are talking about jihad to reconquer or liberate, quote unquote, the Tatar territories, the Bashkir territories, way into Russia. Secondly, I see a great difference between the Afghan jihad that was supported by the United States and what Hamas is doing. Because in Afghanistan, they were fighting against the Shurawi. They're fighting against foreign invaders. Arabs recognize that the Jews lived in historic Palestine, in today's Israel, since time immemorial, since the Exodus from Egypt. And throughout even the Arab presence, the core population remained, and in fact Jerusalem had a majority of Jews pretty much throughout the Muslim presence, the Ottoman presence in the Holy Land. So it is very different. You don't have the empire invading. In fact, when the Jews started to return to Eretz Israel, Jews didn't have a state. There was none. Not empire, not non-empire, no nothing. So it is very, very different case. And of course, the rhetoric of of jihad is manipulated and used by Hamas as it was by its Nazi sympathizing spiritual grandfather, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Thank you. We're going to finish here. Thank you very much for coming.